There. Can you hear me now? Good. The after lunch spot is always the toughest one to get, but we've got an exciting panel here, and we hope to get you, your spirits up, lifted, and engaged here. A great panel to come. Let me say very briefly a few words about myself. My name is Mark Sundberg. I was at the World Bank for 20-odd years and then moved to the Millennium Challenge Corporation. MCC is not a private corporation, for those of you who may not know about it. It is a U.S. government aid agency, not independent from USAID. We like to think of ourselves as being younger, smarter, more agile than aid, but don't record that. And it's an agency that is committed to providing grant financing, large grants, to governments that are eligible, with the explicit purpose of generating growth and poverty alleviation through growth. So it is focused on growth diagnostics and identifying those binding constraints and searching out what are the root causes of that, working closely with partners who believe deeply in country ownership. But we have a very small portfolio on urbanization per se. There are some urban projects in the water sector or power sector, working in Ulaanbaatar or Lusaka. We have a project just getting off the ground in Nairobi. But it's a small share of our portfolio. However, there's a recognition that alongside climate change, technology change, urbanization is one of these forces that is profoundly changing the aid landscape and development landscape. And there's an overpowering need to think, as you look across the next couple of decades, when hundreds of millions will be flowing into cities in the countries where we operate, MCC, but more broadly, aid community. It's really key to look at the ability to work alongside with partners to generate jobs, to look at the need for urban public services, et cetera. It's extraordinarily important. Our session today is going to be in two parts. We have a keynote speaker and then turning to the panel here. I'll introduce the panel later, but I first want to start by introducing Professor Gilles Duranton, who is, we're very lucky to have him here. He holds the Dean's Chair in Real Estate at the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to Wharton, he also had held academic positions at the University of Toronto and the London School of Economics. He's co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics and a research fellow at NBER, as well as at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. His research focuses on urban and transport issues around land use, urban growth, and cost-benefit analysis in cities and clusters. But we're here to listen to the keynote speaker now, so please, Gilles, thank you. And we need to put the slides on the screen. There, great.
Okay, here we go. Thank you very much, Mark, for those kind words. It's a real pleasure to be here. I know it's a great audience, and like Jonathan said this morning, it's a mixed audience. So that's an academic talk. I'll try to make it as accessible to non-academics as possible. I want to talk about, yeah, that works. I want to talk about the cost and benefits of cities. Actually, let me do away with that introduction. Like every single talk on urbanization starts with that first paragraph, right? And if you're here, you know it. So let me instead make two disclaimers. Disclaimer number one, indeed, I decided that I wouldn't try to teach the people with operational responsibilities here how to do their job, because I have no idea. They know that way better than I do. So instead, yes, I'm going to give you my reading of what I think the literature is saying, and this is a literature that's actually reasonably fast evolving because there's lots of new data well available, so I'm trying to go and make sense of it. And the other disclaimer is that I'm going to talk mostly about the cost and benefits of cities and migration, rural, urban, or across cities. That's the stuff I think I know best about. There's lots of other things which I think are really, really important and really, really interesting, but I won't be talking about because, again, I want to talk about the stuff I know better, and we have only 35 minutes. So, yes, what we talked about this morning was the funding of public services, the funding of infrastructure, the organization of city versus state governments. All of those things are hugely important. Urban resilience. I want to write a paper well about that. I'm actually doing some research on this paid by the bank. So it's not that this is alien to me, it's just that choices need to be made. So the first observation I want to make is something that actually I realized one day while preparing for this lecture, is that when we talk about urbanization, we're talking about people moving from a poor rural countryside to cities. And the literature has gone on two ways about that, because there are actually two different things at play. The first one is a wedge. So for a French person, the difference between a wedge, a gap, and a wage, a salary, is really, really hard to tell, right? But I'll do my best. So if you hear rural, that's going to be a wedge. If you hear city, that's going to be a wage gradient. I realized that indeed there are two things. There's a movement from agriculture to non-agriculture, which is a literature that is more interested in structural change, macro development, that is looking at something, and us urban economists looking at agglomeration effects, so the flat part below the arrow, or the upward sloping part below the arrow. And actually these people were trying to go well after the same thing, or thinking that it was one thing, whereas I think it's actually two different things. So that's a graph that I took from Nick and Ed's paper, which I think is really the best illustration of the first one, which is this agricultural wedge. So what you have is productivity for a bunch of countries, so each dot is a country, and what you have is agricultural productivity and non-agricultural productivity. Poor countries are poor because they're not good, they're really unproductive at agriculture. That's startling difference. The difference, so it's a log scale, so the difference of the trend for non-agriculture maybe 1 to 3, 1 to 5, the difference for agriculture maybe up to 1 to 100. So this is a staggering difference. So those rural wages are potentially really, really large. Whereas that's another paper from Ed, where we're looking at, it's a mix of both, but more here looking at trying to go agglomeration effects, what's going on along my arrow with my previous graph. And yes, some economies of agglomeration, apparent economies of agglomeration associated with population densities, anywhere between 5 and 10+%. Same thing, that's a graph that I did some years ago for Colombia, whatever, 5, 6%. So the rural wages, on paper, they look incredibly large. Times 3, times 5, times 7. And, those guys, they've done their homework. This is not about hours. This is not about measurement. This is not about an accounting problem. That's really an output per hour worked that is so much larger in which country, in agriculture, in which countries. The wage gradients across cities are also very pervasive. So now we have evidence on, I think, all continents for that, including Africa, including Asia, including Latin America. I participated into this, and so on and so forth. So here, we usually try to express that as a population size elasticity, i.e., what is the increase in wage associated with an increase in population or an increase in population density, and we find an elasticity of 5 to 10%, which means that between the smallest and the largest cities, that's whatever times 1.5 to times 2. Should we care about that? Yes, we should care about that, especially if we are just taking one person one place and bringing this person to another place and make this person so much more productive. Of course, the big question is how much of those apparent wealth differences are actually like for like. So that leads me to my second observation. Those premiums that we're seeing, they're going to reflect a number of things. They're going to reflect some agglomeration effects. They're going to reflect the fact that people who are more productive may actually be a lot more located in cities, particularly so the largest cities. There may be some compensating wealth differentials at play, and there may also be the fact that some areas, some locations may be more productive than others. So to decompose those things, which has been what I think the agglomeration literature has been trying to do for like 20 plus years in rich countries, trying to do that is really data demanding. You want to be able to follow people well over time. You want to have panels of workers, and you want to have really rich data about places. Those two things are unfortunately sorely lacking in most of the developing world. So let's talk a little bit about First Nature. Yes, New York is more productive because it's a better location. It's a legitimate concern. So in that case, people, instead of bigger, denser locations making people more productive, it could be about people just moving to where world productivity is higher and those places being larger as a result. That would be reverse causation. So the way we address that problem in the literature is to take long historical lags of population, look at the productivity of agriculture nearby, which are all reasonable predictors of city population today, but which we think don't have much to do with today's productivity. You know, the argument here may not be perfect for those things to be instruments, but that's the best we have. And, you know, it's been used times and again, and we don't find very much going on here. It's been adapted well, a few times with that sort of strategy also to look at urban wage premia in developing countries with very similar results. It doesn't seem to be the crux of the story, so we can discard for most of it maybe First Nature. Compensating differentials. For non-economists, it's always hard to think about compensating differentials. The government of Argentina, we were there together. I misbehaved so badly that day. Government of Argentina likes to say that Patagonia, the south of Argentina, is such a huge success because wages are so high. No, people don't want to go there. In order to attract people, they need to pay really high wages because the climate is really unpleasant. Very few people live there. It's very sparsely populated, and so on and so forth. The high wages in Patagonia are, in my mind, to a very large extent, well, a reflection of the fact that those places are very poorly attractive. So, exploring that again in the rich world, we find that, yes, there's a little bit about places with nicer weather in America, having a little bit of a wage that's embedded, a little bit of those amenities, that are embedded in those wages, but it's still very, very small. Potentially, yes, there's something bigger associated with what we call endogenous amenities, but we don't know yet. You know, all those things that make urban life pleasant when we go out, consume, and play. So all those things, yeah, they may be systematically better in larger cities, and that may be capitalized with the wages, but because there's no variation across city sizes, it's really, really hard to know much about that at this stage. In the developing world, there's a very nice paper by Doug Golin and co-authors who shows that, you know, it shouldn't be the case because if anything, amenities are indeed nicer in cities and especially so in larger cities of the developing world. In an interesting twist, Jorge de la Roca and co-authors, they find that in Peru, the wage gradient is pretty steep, like in my graph before, for unskilled labor, but very, very flat for skilled labor. And the interpretation of that, which was supported by other evidence that they provide, is actually it's the small places that need to pay really high wages to skilled labor because, again, skilled labor doesn't want to go to those places. Skilled labor doesn't want to go to secondary cities. They won't be private school for their kids. They won't be places to go out. They won't be nice restaurants, bars, and stuff. When there's only one supermarket in town, it doesn't have very much, etc., etc. The third explanation for why we may be seeing those really, really large wealth differences is that people who live in cities, especially in the larger cities, may be so much more productive. So I was the first one, or among the first ones to make that case in rich countries, saying actually half of that urban wage premium that we're seeing in France is actually people, it's associated with people's education, people's skills, and so on and so forth. And the agglomeration effect is much smaller, maybe half or less of what we're seeing. Evidence for the poor parts of the world has been a long time coming, but we have a couple of papers, and they're saying that, yes, there's a lot of sorting. There's a lot of sorting going on, but not exclusively. It cannot all be explained by sorting. In one paper, they say that, yes, this rural wage need not be maybe, apparently it's 3 to 5 times, but the a lot of it well is sorting, but you still have a residual 10 to 30% left after you've taken out everything you can. So that would be sizable, but perhaps not decisive. A third observation is that following a great observation by Bob Lucas many years ago, taken on after that by Ed and others, is cities are places where we are more productive, but we actually places where we become more productive, i.e. we learn to become more productive, and then when we go away, we may be taking a lot of that with us. So it means that actually when we say sorting of people who command the highest wages on the labor market, regardless of where they might be, these guys being overrepresented in cities, but part of that is actually those guys became more productive, all else equal, regardless of what they might be, by having lived in cities before, by having worked in cities for many years, and now there's actually some evidence by having been born in those places, having been growing up in those places, having studied in those places. So all of that, I think, is changing the way, at least I'm thinking about agglomerations. That's no longer this agglomeration effect that kicks in when you move to the city. It's still part of the story, but you have some location effects that are happening prior to entering with the labor market. Again, birthplace, the environment in which you grow up, the environment in which you study before entering the labor market. Yes, that static effect, the learning on the job, and also something that is potentially really, really important that we don't know very much about is the fact that once you've learned somewhere, you're going to go and work elsewhere, and you're going also to transmit what you've learned to those guys. So it means that the reach of the city actually goes well beyond the confine and well beyond the urban periphery, will actually reach other places through the people that have relocated and will have been training and teaching with the others in those locations. Which also means the counterpart is that if that process of the circulation of skills is not happening, we might be having a problem. Okay, I think I said that already. So, okay, let's now turn to urban costs. So Ed is calling that the demands of density. So as the city grows bigger, yes, the benefits are large, but the costs are large. So housing is the main one. In which countries, that's housing. You know, people in non-metro parts of America, they spend on average 15% of their income on housing. People in San Francisco spend on average 52% of their income on housing. That shows in the data. Congestion and travel costs, the price and variety of goods available locally, amenities that might be varying well systematically well across places, crime, pollution, disease, climate resilience, and so on and so forth. The cost of getting goods to the city, etc., etc. The problem with urban costs is that you cannot just sum all those items. For two reasons. The first one is that they're not additive, because worse amenities, which in a way, you know, if bigger cities have more crime, worse amenities are going to translate into lower housing costs. So those things are not strictly additive. They're sub-additive. And within cities themselves, what does it mean housing cost in city X? You know, housing cost in city X, in the center well of Manhattan, really, really high, but if you go sufficiently far, it's becoming much less affordable. But yes, it will be compensated with transportation costs that are much higher as well, right? So we have those costs that actually greatly differ with the cities. So how do we sum them up? I know of two solutions because I've tried them both. Either you have a model that tells you how to sum them up, or you use basic well-consumer theory from your Macro 1 class, where you try to express a clear well-counterfactual. How much more would I need to spend to stay in this city now with whatever 10% more population, keeping the same standard of living, but the city being bigger? So I've tried both. So both are essentially telling you that you should be doing more or less the same thing. You need to estimate the elasticity of the price of housing at the center. At the center, that's important with respect to population. The share of housing in expenditure, you need to estimate the congestion elasticity, and you need to estimate, independently, amenities and local public goods. So what do we know? What did I learn from doing this exercise in France and the US? Okay, the urban cost elasticity is larger than agglomeration effects, and it needs to be. It needs to be because, okay, the pointer doesn't work very far, but so here what I'm showing on this curve. So the top curve is the wage that's increasing as a function of population size. The bottom curve is urban costs that are also increasing as a function of population size. If urban costs do not end up increasing faster than wages, we want cities to grow to infinite, right? And we know this is not going to be viable. At some point, the slope of urban curve, well, of urban costs will need to be larger, will need to be well higher. So this is what we have on that graph. And at the point where those two slopes are exactly the same, when we do wage minus urban cost, we have a maximum, we have a local maximum. So in the US and in France, those urban costs tend to be a little bit larger than agglomeration effects, which has a number of implications. First, the optimal size of cities, because those things nearly balance with themselves, take a very long time to balance with themselves. In that case, it means that the optimal size may be actually pretty large. It's certainly not 100,000 people, but it may be many millions. Then, because those things also evolve and are moving more or less at the same rate, there will be this upper part of the net wage will be very, very flat. So it means that, yeah, you can be larger than the optimum and it doesn't matter, provided you don't go too freaking large, and you can be smaller and it won't matter too much either. Oops, sorry. And then we may also want cities to be larger than their optimal size, because if you have also a rural area where wages are very, very low, in that case, it's still worthwhile to move people, or for people to move from those really, really low wage areas, even though that's going to push us to, well, beyond what's the maximum. So Mayo even was not too happy to see people coming in Freetown, because yes, we may be to the right of the optimum, but for those guys and for society, as a whole, it's still a good thing, even though it's presenting you with a lot more challenges. I fully understand that. So, the thing is that when we look at cities now being more spatially constrained, i.e., for instance, like in France, you cannot build now beyond the urban fringe, you cannot expand the urban fringe anymore, and all those things, that's making the urban cost elasticity significantly larger. That's making it significantly larger. Or in the short run, when people move in and the stock of housing cannot expand, that's also making urban costs really, really high. Because as people move in, they want to live somewhere. And if the stock of housing is fixed, and it is fixed in the short run, or it is more fixed if you prevent building from happening at the extensive margin, that's going to create some problems. Okay, what about the developing world? There's very, very little. So at some point, I gathered some data for the formal housing sector in Colombia across cities, and finding more or less the same sort of numbers as in France, which at some level was reassuring. But nonetheless, there's this notion that urban costs are actually much larger somehow in emerging cities. For that, we'd need to have a lot more data. Again, that's the usual plea for more research. But we'd also need to think long and hard. Because the problem is that it's not only more data, but it's how do you compare in one part of town some formal housing for which there's a price and for which you have title security and so on and so forth, and another part of town where people live on a slum, there's a shack, and so on and so forth, and maybe the price of that shack is very, very low, but you need to pay through the nose to get services well delivered to you, including water and so on, et cetera, et cetera. You have no tenure rights, so you need to devote immense resources to make sure there's always with somebody at home and all those things. How do you actually conceptualize that? I think it's not easy. Good news is that on the data front, we start knowing more about housing quantities and prices for travel. It's already something. We know the quantities on one side and the prices on the other side. So, some interesting work by Rémi Jedouab. He was here before. He's here. 15 minutes, perfect. Some interesting work by Rémi Jedouab showing that indeed building up is saving space and has potentially large gains, but at the same time, building up is costly. So in the data, in another paper by Gabriela Feld, and in a lot of work by Soli Angel, the bulk of urban expansion is happening with cities expanding horizontally at the extensive margin, right? So maybe 75%, that's a pretty large number. So it means that if we prevent that from happening, growing up, yes, it's desirable, it has some savings, but the savings may be more like 5%. So that's pretty small relative to the cost. In another paper by Remy and Klaus Danninger and some others, they're documenting extraordinarily high levels of crowdedness in the poorest countries. So let me show you actually the graph. I'm not quite sure I really understood exactly the exact numbers, but I really like that graph coming from that paper. So you see that in poor countries, you have volumes of build-up per person, build-up being housing and everything else, of whatever 50 to 100 cubic meters. In richer places, we're quickly reaching 500. So it means that the amount of build-up per person goes up pretty strongly as people get richer. You know, just for housing, we know that the income elasticity of housing, we don't exactly know where it is. Housing is a normal good. It's going to be between 0 and 1, but probably more between 0.5, 0.6 to 1, right? So it means that we actually want to consume more housing as we get richer, keeping the price of housing constant. Of course, if housing doesn't get built, it gets more expensive. So as countries develop and urbanize, we should expect a lot of urban expansion and new constructions. I mean, I think it's an obvious statement to make, but again, Freetown is growing by 4% in terms of population. In many developing countries, income grows by 3 to 4% a year, which means that in terms of demand for housing, that's another shift of maybe 2 to 3% of the demand curve for housing. So 4 plus 2 to 3, that's 6, 7% a year. That's a doubling every 10 years. That's a very, very large number. And again, 75% of that typically happens at the extensive margin. Okay, let's talk about transportation. That's actually, so this time this is work I've done in the recent past. So first, let's compare 4 cities. So Kansas City, that's the fastest large American city. So you see that people can drive whatever, close to 50 kilometers an hour throughout the day on average within the city. The slowest one among the largest cities is New York City. Then let's look at 2 Indian cities, Trichy. I learned that last night thanks to RT with the pronunciation. That's the fastest Indian city, and you see that it's still slower at all times of the day than New York City. And then a really fast, large Indian city, Calcutta, is way, 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 way slower. So basically what we're saying here is that travel is slow in emerging cities. Here, that's another graph that does that across many countries and averaging for all the cities. So United States is going to be an average for 140 cities. Bangladesh is going to be an average over whatever 15 cities and so on and so forth. So you see that there's this elasticity of about 0.1, 0.15. Richer countries, people can drive in cities faster. This is not about congestion. This is not about poor places being congested. If anything, congestion is slowly increasing with GDP per capita. This is about those places, those emerging cities being slow mostly at all times. I'm not saying there's no such thing as congestion. Actually, in our calculation or in our data, well, Bogota is the most congested city of the known universe. And so this is the top curve here. And you see that at night, you can drive at about 35 kilometers, and there's a huge drop. That's what we call well congestion. When people start taking the streets in Bogota, it becomes chaos. And yes, travel speed go on average to 20 kilometers and below. And again, this is an average for the whole city, including your local street that probably never really gets well congested, where you can always drive at 20 kilometers per hour. Just below that, or well below that, is Dhaka. So Dhaka is interesting because it's slow all the freaking time. Right? It's really, really slow. And if you look even below that at Dhaka, at central Dhaka, you see that the best you can do is whatever, 21 kilometers per hour in the middle of the night. And yes, it goes down to 13, 14 during the day. But most of it, the fact that this is not 50 like Kansas City is not congestion. Well, congestion explains only whatever 5, 7, 10 kilometers per hour, not the whole 40. So it's mostly about those places being slow at all times. And then why is that? So then we can try to go one step further and try to understand why this is. We've done some really, really simple regressions, no attempt at those things being perfectly identified, at those relationships being causal and stuff, but what correlates with the two major well correlates of being slow is a lack of major roads, highways, primary, secondary, and even tertiary roads, and the second one is a high population density. It's, at some level, this is not too surprising, right? If you have lots of people being crammed somewhere and no roads, no major roads to go through, yes, the situation on the street is not going to be great. Something that I have a strong suspicion is really, really true, but I don't have data yet to substantiate that, is I think a lot of it is about road quality and the fact that, as was described this morning, the roads get encroached by the sellers, by people playing, by the animals staying around, and so on and so forth, by people hanging out, and all of that. So I would like to know more about that, but I think it's also a big factor. And then, not everything is the same exactly the way is exactly the same the world over. In Bangladesh, for instance, cities are particularly slow, and a lot of it has to do with the presence of water, which is ubiquitous in cities in Bangladesh. And we know that having waters from the other cities, that also slows you down, because that creates bottlenecks, that you need to cross bridges and this and that and stuff, and that doesn't make for things going very fast. So Bangladesh, in part, is there are also natural reasons for why cities in Bangladesh are so slow. Then another thing that I found really interesting about urban costs is that when you look at the studies that compare nominal and real, they find that there's not much a difference between the nominal and the real. They sort of find the same magnitudes, the same numbers and stuff, which at some level is really odd. When you look at US data on expenditure, people who live in San Francisco, that shows. Again, they spend 52% of their income on housing. That shows really, really big time. It doesn't show in emerging cities. So those places, despite very slow, very congested, not having great lack of housing and so on and so forth, those urban costs do not seem to show in the data, income and expenditure data and real income data. So we may not be doing the job very well. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that the adjustments are taking place by not people. Housing is really expensive. Transportation is really difficult. Okay, I'm going to cut down on transportation, but still I'm going to end up spending a lot more on transportation, a lot more on housing nonetheless. In those places, they don't seem to be doing that. They end up consuming very, very tiny quantities of housing, and most of the travel is done walking, so it means that you can go 2-3 kilometers and no more, which means that also your city will no longer operate as a city which will be integrated by people moving from everywhere to everywhere, but being more, as has been well documented in some cases, like a collection of disjoint villages where people do not go through back and forth as much as they used to. So it means that, on top of that, it's polluted, there's crime, and so on and so forth. So it means that we are not able to see those urban costs. They're actually so high that they don't show up through the expenditure, but they actually show up directly through utility by people choosing to travel very little, or being forced into traveling very little, into consuming very little housing as well. So actually, I think, however bad and however congested those places are, improving things so that people actually start moving out more, start consuming more housing, however dysfunctional that might be, those cities may start operating a little bit more than cities. That would already be like a major victory. 2 more observations. How much time?
You have 8 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So 2 more observations, trying to think now, going back to migration and gains from urbanization. So we cannot expect people, when they migrate, to do socially the right thing. They don't take into account the effects that they have on the place that they live, nor on the place that they go to. They look at what are their expected returns and the expected gap when they move. And the word expected here is really, really important, because there's a huge risk dimension when people move places. People in the countryside are exposed to major risks, but moving to cities also entails major risks as well. So the other observation here is that differences, nominal versus real, will be well different. Nominal wage well differences, they reflect differences in productivity. Real wage well differences, they're going to reflect preferences for locations, barriers to mobility, and so on and so forth. So people have gone on actually on that problem in all sorts of different ways. Vernon Henderson, Diego Puga, me, and others, we've tried to do the cost and benefits well calculation, and we find maybe whatever 20 to 30% gain. The observational studies with migration, the results are all over the place, but maybe the better ones are finding gains of 20 to 40%. Experimental evidence also says maybe gains of maybe 40%, and structural models of migration also will come up in the same ballpark. Those numbers are not exactly the same, but 20 or 40% at some level, given the margins of error, that's the same number. So it means that not huge gains from migrating, but somewhat large gains from migrating when nonetheless. So it means that, yes, people are moving and they're moving for good reasons. This has implications if you're in charge of running one of those places where people move to, but they're actually doing that for a good reason. And actually, they may not be moving quite fast enough, actually, given how poorly productive the countryside is. So just to finish on the policy implications, I work in a business school, so I will have 3 A's. That's what we give to the kids anyway, right? So accommodate. So Solly Angel is going to talk more about that. We talked about this morning. We're going to talk again about that later this afternoon. Yes, I think we need to accommodate rising urbanization for urban growth, because however dysfunctional urbanization might be at the moment, it still means actually people improving their lot, and improving their lot maybe not immediately, but over some period of time, over their life cycle, and their children actually perhaps being born in a better place where they will be able to do so much better in their own lifetime. So it doesn't mean, of course, a free-for-all. This morning, there were some divergence of opinion. I'm still of the opinion that, yes, there should be some management of that. Where should be the growth areas, where the public goods would need to be provided, and so on and so forth, of course. We need to, as places develop, we also need to improve the transportation infrastructure, build roads, enlarge some of the existing ones and stuff. I think in some places we've given up on that because, yes, politically this is really hard. People do not want their street to be enlarged into like a secondary road, well, for sure, or a principal arterial. Ameliorate for 3 A's rather than improve, but that's synonymous. To reduce urban dysfunction. So yes, people moving to cities, even with dysfunctional cities, that's an improvement for them, but actually try still to improve those cities. So it feels like treading water, but the list is really, really long, but there's lots of good things that people can do, setting up land registries, reducing sexual harassment in transit, and you name it, there were like millions of good things that can be done, with hopefully with the notion that as things improve, the quality of the underlying institutions is going to improve. So let me be Danny Roderick for like 10 seconds today. And then also think of cities as being associate and think of cities as being part of the system. I mean, I've been doing that for many, many years now. Here, it's really about skill mobility. I think a big part of the problem of secondary cities or smaller cities in many parts of the developing world is the fact that skilled labor doesn't want to go there because those places are really poorly unattractive to them. I don't know then where to take it from there, because that's a really, really hard problem, but I think this is a big part of the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilles. I think you fit 3 or 4 lectures into a remarkable 35 minutes and exactly on time. So a lot of I'll have to rethink my retirement in Central Dhaka, however, it's seeing the results there. The second part of the presentation today is to go through this eminent panel we have, and I will first introduce them briefly and then be posing questions to each of them. First, sitting to the left of Gilles, is Catalina Muralanda. She is the practice manager for urban resilience and land in East and Central Africa region of the bank, covering 12 remarkable countries, very interesting countries. Her work covers financing of infrastructure, providing basic services in the region, technical assistance for policy and institutional reform, and policy advisory work in several areas, pardon me, related to urbanization. To her left is Hugh Cole, who is the Director of Policy and Strategy in Cape Town City. He is responsible for policy, strategic planning, economic analysis, and partnerships. And previously, he was the Director of Country Programs at the International Growth Center in conjunction with London School of Economics and Oxford University, responsible for teams covering 14 different countries, both in Africa and South Asia. And to Hugh's left is Ming Jiang. He is World Bank's practice manager for urban development, disaster risk management, and land in the East Asia and Pacific region. He leads work on financing and analytic work in several Asian countries, ranging from small Pacific island countries to Indonesia, and has worked in over 40 countries, including in South Asia and the Latin America region. And to his left is Omar Masood. Some of you will remember from this morning's panel as well. Omar is a member of the Pakistan Administrative Service and Chief Executive of the Urban Unit in Pakistan, as well as the Cities that Work Council member. Previously, he was the Additional Secretary, a very senior position, in the Punjab province government. And finally, Elena Ianchovichina is lead economist and the head of Frontier Knowledge, Jobs, and Cross-Cutting Solutions Group in the World Bank. Previously, she was deputy chief economist in the Latin American Caribbean region, which she'll be representing today. Her work focuses on geography of urban employment, inequality, inclusive growth, and several other areas pertinent to our discussion today. So let me start with the first question to you, Catalina. You're looking toward Africa's future, given demographic trends, population movement, but relatively low urbanization. Our panelists have been introduced by the level of urbanization in each continent, by the way. Relatively low urbanization. Do you see rapid urbanization, the formation of megacities in coming period, and what do you see as the principal challenges to support greater agglomeration, productivity, and growth in cities as they urbanize? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome, Gilles, to the bank again, and thanks for that presentation. So I will talk about what I have seen or I see in Africa, which is picking up on a couple of the points that were made by Gilles and focusing on that promise and that opportunity part of the title of the presentation. I think there is an urgency to focus in Africa in the opportunities that cities bring. We have 25 years of a window of opportunity before population explodes and cities become very, very large. And there is a lot that needs to change in the way cities are growing for them to capture those promises and these opportunities. And so 4 entry points that I see, 3 of which were picked up were presented by Gilles in his presentation. The first one being the most evident to me, which is affordable housing. Affordable housing in cities in Africa doesn't exist. And this doesn't mean low-income housing. This means housing that is affordable at all income levels of the population. And so supply of housing is very limited, and financing for housing is very limited. So across the value chain, there is no housing. And what happens when you have this large influx of people into cities in Africa and there is no housing is informality. Slums, cities are growing, expanding in a completely unplanned and informal way. This drives informality in wages and jobs, and the costs of providing infrastructure in cities that have grown that way, retrofitting those cities in the future is prohibitive. So doing something about housing so that cities stop expanding in this way, laying out areas for expansion and providing infrastructure of those areas is really something that we really, really need to focus on. Housing policies at the national level is something that doesn't exist in the majority of the countries that I work in, and so continuing to work on housing policy at the national level and what that scales down to be in cities is really important. The second point, again from the presentation, is transport and road networks. One of the things that is really striking when you go to Africa is the amount of people that are walking down the main arteries. There's like a stream of people day and night walking. People walk to their jobs. No? Our colleague Shomek Lal had the statistics on Nairobi that 42% of people in Nairobi walk to their jobs, and this is 11% of the job. Half of Nairobi walks to their jobs. That's insane. And jobs are in the neighborhoods where you live. There is this fragmentation of cities, and there are no roads. There are no paved roads, much less public transport and mass transport, but we have to really support cities in investing in jobs. When we talk to mayors around Africa, the first thing they ask for is roads. No? And so really housing and jobs, combining those two really is going to have an incredible impact in the way cities grow, and we need to do more on those fronts. The third point, related to secondary city, but more higher level, is decentralization. The decentralization agenda in Africa is incomplete. There's a lot of laws written about it, but the actual power that the cities have to do things is very, very limited. There is no accountability, there is no mandate. The mayor of Freetown talked about it this morning. Mayors don't have the power to do, in the majority of the cities of Africa, to do what they're supposed to do. They don't have the financing to do it, and they're really, really strapped into what they can do with the resources that they have, the capacity that they have. So continuing to work on centralization and really opening opportunities for mayors and local governments to do more is something that we need to continue to do actively across Africa. And then the last one, which you didn't mention, Gilles, and I know it came up this morning, is resilience. No? Some of the highest urban costs that we're seeing now come from the managing these risks and these disasters. No? The increasing population brings exposure, brings vulnerability, and cities are just really folding under the costs of that. No? It wipes out, one flood wipes out percentage points of GDPs in these countries and in these cities, and they cannot recover from that. They still are struggling. The cities that I work with struggling with 2-3 years ago, the floods of 3 years ago, and they get pounded again by the next flood. So either we do something about adapting to climate change and other natural and being able to manage other disasters, or cities will never get out of this trajectory of recovery and move into a more productive and resilient work. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, there. Hugh, turning to you next. Cape Town is known as a very vibrant, dynamic, and thought to be a very successful city, albeit thirsty. And from your experience, what do you view as the major challenges that have emerged in urbanization in Cape Town and that it's faced, and what approaches are being implemented to address those challenges? In particular, what are positive lessons for other countries that you see emerge from Cape Town's experience?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for that really good tour of the evidence, Gilles. It was very helpful. So first, I think let me say that, you know, just where does South Africa fit in those charts that we just saw? You know, we're really highly urbanized. So on those charts, we're kind of similar to Chile or Venezuela. And I think largely the merits of urbanization, at least at a policy level, at a national level in South Africa, that argument's won. You know, I think, and we urbanized quite early in our history, and not least of all because of apartheid spatial planning and the development model that happened under apartheid. So, and in terms of, you know, we're sort of on a curve of volume per capita against development. On that chart, we're sort of midway along that curve, along with China, Thailand, and Brazil. But, you know, I think probably certainly maybe like Brazil, there's a large amount of inequality. So some people in South African cities consume a lot of space, and a great many consume very little. But that's true of South Africa in general, high levels of inequality. So I think a few comments in terms of what we're doing. So we have a very clear objective as a city government to put reducing poverty through meaningfully faster economic growth at the center of our strategy. And to do that, we're focusing on quality basic services and on safety. So those are speaking to some of those demons of density that have been outlined, but then also transport, housing, and amenities like parks and environmental services. So that's a sort of at a very high level is our strategy, and we are. In terms of transport, I think we're doing what we can on public transport. We are expanding, some of the bus rapid transport systems. I would like to just say something at the end about the tension there between expansion and financial sustainability of public transport. But so we are expanding the bus rapid transport system in the way that we can. We are taking, on the topic of devolution, we're taking up the fight with national government around the collapse of the passenger rail service in Cape Town. So we have a passenger rail service that should be able to carry huge numbers of people at relatively low cost from where they live to work opportunities, and it currently carries 95% less people than it did a decade ago. And it's a state-owned enterprise that has just collapsed through mismanagement. And it's an example of, you have a structure of responsibilities, and you have a constitution that sets out the powers between different, national, provincial, and local government. But we're having to test that, and if necessary, ideally through cooperation, if necessary through intergovernmental dispute. But we're having to test those boundaries, and we're doing it in transport. We're also doing it in energy, which I can say something about. And then we're investing a lot in road quality and investing in our road network. That has become a little bit of a kind of an unpopular thing to say amongst the donor community. People don't really want to talk to you if you want to say, well, we'd like to talk to you about funding roads. But I think understandably, because of the climate change agenda, the response is more, well, don't you want some electric buses rather? It is encouraging that the evidence is still there that roads are good. On transport, on housing, I think what we're doing is trying to expand housing of all types. We have a backlog of housing, and we have a growing population. So population's growing about 3% a year, and so we need housing across the full value chain. We need housing at low cost, but we also need housing for young professionals who want to move to Cape Town. It's one thing being a tech hub for the tech sector, but if you price people out and you have a sort of California-style problem where you have too many restrictions on formal housing development, then those tech sector jobs are going to go elsewhere. We're doing, interestingly, and I can speak more about this later if it's of interest, but one of the things we're doing, because of the fiscal crisis in South Africa and the collapse of grant funding for sort of public housing programs, we're moving towards trying to work, instead of seeing private initiatives to develop small-scale rental units, so taking previously what was one house on an earth and turning it into a small block of flats. Rather than seeing that as a sort of illegal activity which we want to try and stamp down, we actually shifted our strategy completely, and we're saying that's a good thing. It's creating jobs, it's creating much-needed affordable accommodation. Let's try and work with it to make it safer, make sure that it doesn't negatively affect the sewage system, et cetera, et cetera. We're investing very heavily in reducing crime. Again, there's a tension there with the national government because policing is actually a national power. But we are investing in law enforcement and advocating for investigation powers, et cetera, so that we can do more about crime without necessarily having to wait for national government. And then I think a big focus of ours, and it's interesting to me that it doesn't come, I haven't heard a lot of discussion about it so far yet, is infrastructure aside from housing and transport. Because for us, sometimes the development, when a new development needs to happen, or in a part of the city there's a plan to densify it, one of the reasons it cannot happen is because the engineers say, water and electricity engineers say, you can't do it because you don't have the bulk, we don't have the bulk capacity for that. Sorry, no, we're not signing it off. And so having a strategy for the city, having a spatial plan is really good, but you also need to have really robust long-term infrastructure pipelines for wastewater treatment, fresh water supply, and electricity networks. Because, I don't think we talk enough about those as enablers of high-quality housing development in cities, because they can certainly be a brake, and they can certainly play into those sort of low amenity scores or downsides, the demons of density. And then maybe just to wrap up, so our big goal is to try and increase help the economy to grow more than the population. That's our kind of long-term goal. If the economic growth rate can be higher than population growth rate for long enough, and we do the things to address inequality in its different forms, we'll be making progress. So that's the kind of very high-level goal. So just a couple of observations. So one is this question of being a compact city versus allowing expansion. And effectively what I'm hearing is we're probably going to need to do both. Just a couple of observations on that is in South Africa, we really, and our own our City of Cape Town spatial strategy is very focused on densifying the urban inner core. But it's slow. It's really slow. And so there is pressure to expand the city on the margins, and it's not always from people in the lowest income groups who want to set up informal settlements. It's often, more upper end, higher end developments. But the tension there is every time you allow development to further and further out, you complicate the economics of public transport, and you put budgetary pressure on having to roll out utility infrastructure on the margins, which means you're not investing in the core. So that's a tension, I think. And then I was encouraged by the comment about the costs of being too large or small. That's very encouraging, and we need to, I think often for our sometimes our political principles have to deal with the messiness of a rapidly growing city, and that's complicated, but I think being able to hold on to that idea that a bigger city is not necessarily a bad thing, it's actually a good thing, is an important message to keep. I think in the South African context, we've won the argument about urbanization is important, but now winning the argument that bigger is not necessarily bad is probably the next stage. And then the last thing I just want to say is we've invested very heavily in using our administrative data much better. And so we've got a city data strategy, and we're investing in the skills and the systems to very actively use our own administrative data, and now trying to pull in data from other sources, because we recognize that if we aren't data-driven and we don't have really data-informed decisions, dealing with this kind of complexity and making these trade-off decisions is going to be extremely hard. So that's something that we're taking very seriously. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. We'll move down the line. Ming, East Asia has some of the largest urban areas in the world and has had rapid urbanization. I'm wondering if you could talk about principal challenges as you see them, and perhaps reflect on the 3 A's that Gilles left us with on accommodating by planning, the role of planning, amelioration, reducing dysfunctions, and to the extent that it's possible to wrap thinking around the question of association, that cities are part of systems. How has that helped to think about Asia's experience?
Thanks a lot. So East Asia has been relatively successful in managing its urbanization. It has had a lot of a very rapid process of urbanization, but also has been pretty successful in exploiting the benefits of urbanization. And I think why the reason for success using Professor Duranton's sort of framework is I think they have been quite good at sort of expanding the benefits of agglomeration while reducing the cost of urban cost during the urbanization process. I think the EAP, East Asia urbanization, has largely been driven by the economic growth. There is a strong accompaniment between economics, the structural change of of East Asia economies and the urbanization rate. We recently looked at it, for example. It's actually interesting, there's a strong correlation, and the inflection point is about 80% of non-agricultural GDP. When the countries reach 80% of non-agricultural GDP, their urbanization in East Asia really taking off. And we do see strong the wage premium that you, Professor Duranton, mentioned. Mark Roberts did the work for Indonesia, And not only you see the difference in wage premium between rural and urban area, but also between the peripheral urban areas, small cities, and metropolitan cities. And you do see a big wage premium. So I think the East Asia sort of, in a way, that economic sort of driven model of urbanization has been benefiting a lot the country's economy. On the cost of urban costs, I think they have been pretty. Many cities have been good at reducing the cost of urbanization. I think if you look at the rapid transit system, the metro system in East Asia, all the way from Tokyo to Seoul and many of the sort of Chinese cities, it's no coincidence that they have the largest one, almost largest one in the world, and it is being very important in enable the cities, the metropolitan areas to function even with the size that they have. A big part of the cost, reducing the cost of urbanization is also how they manage land, and especially the land assembly process under different kind of regimes. So I think that's just reducing the cost of urban cost. But I think the one thing is the housing cost still has been a challenge across the different, all the way from Seoul to Hong Kong to Indonesia and Vietnam, still has a sort of high housing cost. Now, looking at the future sort of challenges, I think once the demographic change, there's a rapidly sort of aging process in the cities. And I can see that actually many cities are adapting the urban planning and the design process to accommodating the aging population. The World Bank recently, we published a report called Silver Hue, Age-Ready Cities, to really look at different approaches, whether it's transport, whether it's housing, whether it's design of public space, to accommodate, actually facilitate different age groups in cities. And finally, I think the climate change is having big impact on the cities. One of the things, the urbanization happening in East Asia is it's actually quite often urban expansion is happening in areas with high climate risk. In the recent report by the World Bank, the GFDR, looking at the flood across the cities around the world. And in East Asia, urbanization somehow tend to happen in the most flood-prone areas, rather than avoiding the flood. You're happening in the most flood-prone areas, and that increased the risks for cities, especially with the urbanization. I think finally, just many cities are actually working on this. You can see the change in the way that the cities work, plan and develop in accommodating the consideration of climate change. I think how to be more resilient, how to be more green. And I think at the local level, you can see the smart approach that would allow cities to grow both low carbon and more resilient and more competitive. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. Turning to Omar, you have deep experience with one of Pakistan's real megacities in Lahore, but I'm sure very familiar with Karachi as well. And I'm wondering about what you see from Gilles' presentation as principal policy approaches to address the challenges in Pakistan, but also if you have time to reflect on Pakistan's system of fiscal federalism and the challenges that are posed by central government to province and to third level of government that is so important in the fiscal framework of Pakistan?
Okay, well, the fiscal one was really a surprise. I was not expecting that question, but I know the answer to that. Fiscally, I think cities are the most malnourished entities in Pakistan, because cities are not treated as cities, they are treated as local governments. So you have a three-tier system. You have the federal government, you have the provinces. The federal government and the provinces have got their shares almost constitutionally enshrined in the constitution. It's very difficult to take away resources from them. You'll have to make major changes in the constitution. But when it comes to local governments, and local governments will also include urban local governments, the situation is much more different. The law is much more flexible, and that's what's happening. Cities are being burdened with additional responsibilities. Their population is growing, but the necessary resource transfer is not being made. And one of the reasons is that why we have not been able to handle it like East Asia has been able to handle it is because the cities have not been given the necessary resources. And at the end of the day, and this is also following from the previous presentation before lunch, this is fundamentally also a question of resources. We can talk about at length, but fundamentally, if Lahore is getting, which is the biggest city, it is about 12 million people. If the property tax revenue of Lahore is 6 billion rupees, and 6 billion rupees is what is about $30 million. That's our annual property tax revenue for a city of 12 million. I mean, I can show you maps and I can show you so many things, but that's not going to fix the problem. So fundamentally, that's a danger we have when we are actually making these discussions, that we sort of push out the elephant from the room, which is basically the financing and the municipal part of it, because it just makes the whole thing very difficult. And that's why the keynote address is so important, and certain words that I would specifically like to refer to. The use of the word accommodate, I don't know, perhaps for a lack of a better word, but in our culture, when we write on a file or something that please accommodate, that means laws and rules are on one side, you have to do something to fix the problem. No, it's, I'm not trying to be very disparaging about what we do, but the fact of the matter is accommodate means is that one way is we come to a realization that urban planning is not having any effect, and like India, we've also have urban plan and master plans, and they are never put into effect, and there are so many violations of it, and we throw in the towel. I would not say. I would say that accommodation is perhaps a way to go, that you just do not try to fix the entire problem, but try to fix part of the problem, and even if it limps along, it will be still moving forward. So that comes to the second part, which is amelioration of dysfunctions. So you simplify the problem and you look at a city from a point of view of dysfunctions, rather than trying to look at a city as a grandiose vision that this is my transformative vision for the city. That will be always there, but first you actually try to, figure out the defects of it. Now, what we have been doing in Pakistan, and this is the biggest challenge that we have been facing, is this issue of capacity at the local government level, with the responsibility that they are also responsible for running the cities. We came up, and this is still a draft, but we came up with a law which was known as the Spatial Authority Law. My sense as the chief executive of the urban unit is that this would be an enabling legislation, so that all that we want to do in terms of deregulating things, in terms of making things flexible, perhaps that spatial authority could give that type of an enabling framework. But the danger with lawmaking is that they suffer a regulatory capture. So all of a sudden, then there are people, they said they would make the argument, because cities do not have that capacity, let the provincial government sort of do the master planning or the designing of the city. And when that happens, there is a tension which actually develops that you are taking away the planning functions from the city. Again, this resonates from the previous, session. Why is planning so important? Why has planning become so important? I mean, we talk about urban planners as low people on the totem pole, but they are no longer as unimportant as they were like 50 years ago. Land prices are going through the roof. In urban areas, if you own land, and if you are a landowner in urban areas, you've got it made. I mean, you can send your children to an Ivy League school if you sell a 500 square yard plot in Lahore. You can send them to Princeton or Harvard if they don't get a scholarship. But they'll do if they're bright enough, but you can. That is as important. So if I were to sort of make an equivalence of land prices, so why is planning functions becoming so contested? And you saw it from the last presentation, is that, we are not in charge of planning. That has been taken away from it because, especially in South Asia, land has become a very, very valuable commodity. I'll sort of wrap up. If we can share the slides also. What you see behind me is the province of Punjab. So one way of looking at it is as a glass half full, and one way of looking at it is as a glass half empty. The presenters showed us a glass half full. I'm going to show you the glass half empty. So if you look at Punjab, this is 125 million people in this province, and the red dots are urban settlements which are growing at 4.5 to 7.5% based on annual population growth. And the green and the yellows are also significant. And as Chief Executive Officer of the urban unit, there are 120 classified urban settlements, towns, intermediate cities, secondary cities, mega cities. And I'm sorry, I just know the name of 10 of them. I don't know the remaining names. So that's how unconscious we are about what's happening in the province. Let's go forward. And this is what is going to happen in 2047. Because of these high growth rates, these are the type of cities that we are going to have. We will have a mega city of 10 million, but then there will be 3 cities between 5 to 10 million, 24 cities between 1 to 5 million. I mean, these are huge numbers, and 2047 is not that very far away. Next slide, please. But, this idea of how can we actually reduce urban cost and focusing on transportation and systems of cities, this is regional accessibility. So what has happened in Punjab is, and I think this was also in the keynote, as far as internal roads in the cities are concerned, they are a mess. So getting out of Lahore takes you 1 hour. But getting to Lahore takes you much less. So the intercity road network is fantastic. It's developing, it's growing, it's becoming even more faster. But the internal city network is very different. So let me give you an example. So the northern part of Lahore, they do not dine in the southern part of Lahore. They, in fact, go to the city of Gujranwala, which is 40 kilometers away. And that's because they've got a good road network. There are no red lights in between. There's no congestion. I was not aware of it. Once I visited Gujranwala, then the hotel owners at that time told me that we are also serving north of Lahore because Lahore is so congested. So if you look at these diagrams on an intercity level, all cities are very well connected. 90 minutes time, you almost covered the entire province. So you can move from city to city very, very quickly. Next. Now, this is an idea that we are trying to float. And this is a very simple system of cities. So Sambrial, which is the top right-hand corner, is a very small city. Sialkot is an intermediate city, and Deska is another small city. Sambrial, Deska, the three corners of these triangles, they export about 2 billion of sports goods and surgical instruments. That's what the potential is of these cities or of these towns. Now, the idea is how can we improve mobility of labor between these cities, This is where they are actually learning. This is where the agglomeration effect is actually taking place. And what the urban unit proposed, and this is still on the anvil, is that instead of making industrial zones, let's have in situ sort of development corridor, industrial corridor, economic corridor development. So think of cities not as like large blobs, but think of cities as triangles, squares, or polygons, which you can join up in a system of cities. This is very preliminary work because we don't have the enabling legislation for it. The spatial authority was meant to actually allow this thing to happen. But sort of, the tension between regulating too much and allowing these things to happen sometimes spoils the law, and that is, something in limbo. I will end here. I have much to say on affordable housing, but I think I've actually run out of time on that one.
We're running a bit short of time. I'll have to jump quickly to Elena. Elena, speaking from the standpoint of your deep experience in Latin America, which is a region with the highest urbanization, equivalent to North America, higher than European urbanization, what do you view as the main constraints to greater productivity? Latin America is, of course, much poorer than North America or Europe. And question about what is needed to get greater productivity and what policies will be required to boost that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Indeed, Latin America has a urban productivity problem. It is known as the urban productivity paradox of dense cities that are not very productive places. Empirical evidence actually suggests that in most countries in the region, the agglomeration economies are weak. They're very low. Sometimes they're negative, in fact. Here Mark has worked on a report in 2018 on cities, and they show clearly this challenge. It is the case that Latin American cities actually benefit from the concentration of skills in cities, but they fail to capture the broader benefits through density and market access. Now, one reason for the low agglomeration economies is the fact that agglomeration costs are very high in the region, and they are in the form of what Professor Duranton mentioned: high housing costs, crime, congestions, mobility issues of all sorts, informal competition. But a recent new report shows that we also have a problem in terms of limited benefits, limited gains from agglomeration. This study points to three structural and intertwined reasons that limit the gains from agglomeration. And they're referred to as 3 Ds. They're the deindustrialization of Latin American cities, the high costs of distance between cities, and divisions within cities in Latin America. And because these intertwined structural factors affect cities where we have a great concentration of the Latin American workforce, they also provide one explanation for the persistently low economic growth at the aggregate level in these countries. So if we look at the first D, the industrialization of cities, what we know from work that we've done with Remy Jedwab and colleagues, the industrialization has affected cities of all sizes in the region, but has been particularly pronounced in the largest ones. With the shift, with the fall in industrial employment, what we've seen is a shift in the composition of employment towards low productivity, less dynamic, non-tradable services, which of course has negative implications for labor productivity and for growth in urban areas. Services of this type don't benefit from endogenous innovation, dynamic productivity gains through international trade. And we also find as part of this project that this type of services gain less from agglomeration than urban tradables, particularly when they're provided in very congested cities. And we have many such cities in the region. The second problem is the high transport costs between cities. And we compare these bilateral, actually, transport costs between urban areas in the region with similar regions and the developed economies. And we find that they're really actually on the high side. That, of course, has negative implications for the ability of firms and people to move, for limiting market access, knowledge spillovers, and of course the ability of manufacturing firms in particular to specialize by relocating to smaller urban centers. One reason for these high transport costs, we look into that, is the fact that governments have underinvested, the countries have underinvested in infrastructure, transport infrastructure connecting cities, in particular the more productive and populous urban areas. And the third problem is actually within cities. Latin American urban areas are typically segregated into distant and poorly connected affluent, high income, and low income sections. So cities, in a sense, are both divided and slow in Latin America, and also congested. And this, in a city of that type, agglomeration economies are actually limited geographically to the more prosperous sections of the urban areas where formal companies are located and amenities are abundant. While many other residents of the same cities live, those who live in low-income neighborhoods, typically on the periphery of cities, they are trapped in informality. They usually remain engaged in different activities in these areas. In these sections of the city, we find that amenities are scarce and basic services are deficient. So the agenda in front of governments in Latin America is they have to implement policies at 3 spatial scales. At the national level, they need to improve the competitiveness of the economy, to stimulate the growth of urban tradables and their potential to create jobs in urban tradables. This is a very ambitious agenda. It involves a wide range of policies that they need to implement to improve macroeconomic management and education, to improving competition policy, innovation policy, and the business environment. At the regional level, there is also an important work to be done to improve the connectivity between cities, to improve transport networks that connect cities within and across countries in the region to boost regional trade and to boost domestic trade. In addition, because this is going to take time, they need to also address competition in the competition issues in the transport sector, and also to stimulate competition, in a sense, in that sector, to lower prices, and to work on increasing the connectivity, the digital infrastructure, to improve access to very high-quality internet services, which are sort of very costly for the disadvantaged populations of the region. And finally, at the local level, local governments need to improve the livability and competitiveness of cities, to improve amenities. I agree with Professor Duranton, amenities in secondary cities are lacking, and that prevents them from growing and attracting talent. But also there is an agenda to link, to reduce barriers to mobility of people located in remote areas, so that they can access economic opportunities in the formal economy. And this agenda is quite important for several countries in the region where regional inequality still remains high. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I did ask Gilles if he could make a few points or responses to what you've heard at the table today. If you could do that in a couple of minutes, Gilles.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. Jonathan Leap should be happy, hopefully. This morning he talked about the need for debate and interactions, and I think this is about as good as it can get. Maybe not on my side, but at least on the side of the respondents, really trying to play ball with, in this dialogue between more academic, scholarly research and stuff that's happening on the ground. So I think we should be happy with ourselves here. Personally, I view my job as an economist in the policy world as pointing out what I think the key trade-offs are and providing some sense of magnitudes about these trade-offs and then typically staying there. Another thing that came back a few times in the discussions is the slowness of it all. And this morning also Mayor Yvonne talked about the slowness of it all, which I think brings some irony here, because I remember Paul Romer telling me maybe 10 years ago why he actually stopped doing work on education and research and development. He told me, oh, for development, this is going to take way too long. It's going to take generations. Urbanizations can happen very quickly. Yes, it can. People can move to cities very quickly. Building the cities is taking way too long. So I think, yes, however misled we can be sometimes. Things, yes, that I've neglected in my talk, for sure, resilience. I actually have a project with the bank on this. Here it's also one point where to understand why this relationship between academia and policy making is not easy, because I remember Marianne Fay back in the day telling me, oh, why don't you do something about urban resilience? I'm like, yeah, but what? And, you know, like forming an agenda, developing an agenda where we start asking interesting questions takes a lot of time. And here, on that particular point, actually, Guy Michaels, who's somewhere at the back of the room, played a really important role, like, okay, over like many years, articulating what the questions are. And now, okay, I think we have some idea of where to go, but that doesn't show up well just like this. Water, yes, I think we should be talking more about water. There's a paper by Ed, my sometimes co-author Matt Turner has done some work also on 19th century America. We need to know more. I always thought that water was the new transportation for academic research, but that never came to be, so hopefully at some point it will. Also, something that I enjoy from those meetings is Masoud's example about the time it takes to leave cities. Actually, I'm working with Matthias Herrera, who was in the room not too long ago, doing something on exactly this. And yes, this is something that you get to observe, not in all countries, because some countries have slow roads between cities, but many countries actually have a reasonably fast system of intercity connectivity, but getting in and out of the cities is really difficult and really problematic. And yes, it shows in some data that we've collected for 145 countries of the world. I was also very intrigued by this notion of triangle and corridor, because yes, at some level, we won't be able to grow dysfunctional cities of 20 million people. They will be very, very dysfunctional, I feel. So trying indeed to develop larger multipolar urban regions seems like a good idea. But then it all hinges on whether those cities in between will not be pulled away by the centers and are actually viable. So Steve Redding and others have models where they say, yes, as transportation costs will go down, there'll be some expansion away of the major centers and some dispersion. But I remember a previous generation of model that was sometimes saying the contrary.
Great, thank you. My apologies for not imposing more time discipline to allow for questions and answers, but there will be plenty of time, I think, this afternoon and tomorrow. And these issues, these are wicked problems. They're multidisciplinary, they're very complex, and there will be a lot of discussion to follow up here. But thank you all, and a round of applause for the panel.
very quickly before we all depart, so there is a little coffee break now, but then the thematic sessions split in rooms. So urban expansion is going to be here in the Preston Auditorium. Incremental housing is going to be in MC4-800, which is on the 4th floor. I would just recommend asking some of the student helpers to perhaps walk you to some of these areas if you're not familiar with the bank's premises. And City Structures is going to be MC13-121. This is, of course, all online in our wonderful agenda. But yeah, if you need any help, find some people who can hopefully take you to these areas. And I'd recommend leaving maybe 5 minutes, 25 past, to make your way. All right, thank you, everyone. Enjoy coffee.